Good evening, yogis. Week 2 for those of you participating in the yoga for spinal health and kind of this integration of working all of the musculature that's important for keeping the spine healthy and stable. So just a quick recap on what Dr. Elan mentioned yesterday in her little blurb at the beginning of practice, considering the natural curves that we're meant to have in the spine, and understanding that we talked about how they develop over time when we're babies, that we are born with just the one curve, and then we learn to lift our heads, and then we learn to stand up, and the other curves are built into the spine. And that this idea that over years of compensated movement or habitual ways of being in our body, the spine degenerates, and that this degeneration can cause shifts and changes to the bone structure, which therefore then affects the musculature that has a job to do what it's meant to do, but the bones are not necessarily operating the way they're meant to because they have changed in shape. So I believe that was kind of the recap on what Dr. Elan talked about. Also mentioned the multifidi muscles. So these muscles that run from the transverse processes of the spine, or each vertebrae of the spine. So small muscles, deep muscles, and their importance when it comes to proprioception, and they're kind of sensors in how where our bodies are in space, and important when it comes to strengthening. So we did a couple of exercises in relation to that. So from there, we will begin on our backs. I think all we had yesterday were 2 blocks and a blanket for support for the knees. And we just began on our backs. Knees bent, feet planted, and just creating this awareness, again, surrounding the deep layers of the core, the transverse abdominis. So we can kind of consider this maybe as like a sheath that wraps around the entire structure. When we talk about kind of the tangible points that we're able to maybe feel it or connect to it, that doesn't mean that's the only place that it is. This just helps us to kind of create some tangibility with that. So finding that engagement, and the exhales being that important component. And we just went with kind of the marching of the feet up and down without losing the connection to that. And you can do that 10 to 20 repetitions up and down. So we're really aware of, and this is exaggerated, but kind of the tendency that to create compensation and to take maybe the path of least resistance. So really finding that connection to stability, where the pelvis isn't rocking forwards nor back, and the spine isn't changing in terms of its natural curves either. So, and that maybe was a point I should have mentioned. When we're talking about these natural curves that are in the spine, we're working from a perspective, at least from my perspective, we're working from this place of wanting to support the spine in its natural habitat, the way that it's meant to perform. I think previously in some old ways of practicing core work, we were taught to imprint the spine, which is not its natural curve, and that's why we're continually kind of talking about this neutrality, this natural position. So if you can gather a sense of that in your practice, in everything that you do, in walking and in sitting and in laying and in side bending, so just really being aware of what that neutral position is and how can I support it. So we went from there, a couple repetitions of that, and then we moved from here into bridge. We took the block, placed it on its smallest width option between the thighs, and just created that awareness of squeezing the block and the connection to the inline of the thighs with the pelvic floor, which is kind of the bottom component to that container that we spoke of last week. So the adductors being an important piece to this engagement. Arms were beside us, and the first round the heels were close enough that you could brush them with your fingertips. And then we again articulated your neutral spine, so not imprinted. It's not a bone by bone lift, so we're not trying to find mobility here. We're trying to move with stability. So lifting up. And last week we kind of focused on this kind of halfway point and the softening of the glute max. So this time the focus was more on the engagement of the glute max, but the lower fibers, so where we tend to maybe have a smaller firing capacity or less firing capacity. So rising up enough that you kind of felt like there was a straight line between the shoulders, the hip bones, a diagonal straight line rather than kind of this type of situation, and the knees or the thighs. And then we added just this really small engagement. So it was a release, so just a gentle release. And then this idea of taking the skin of your sacrum, or maybe you talk about your pubic bone. So skin of sacrum towards knee crease, pubic bone towards belly button, and then just a gentle release. So my pelvic bones, or my hip bones rather, are not moving up or down. They're staying in the exact same plane. The strength is coming from the glutes. And you'll feel the hamstrings as well kicking in. And probably feeling some sensation across the front of the thigh through the quadriceps in a way that they're stretching. And then we released that. Again, kind of this idea of a unit rather than a bone by bone articulation. Not that it's bad to do it that way, but just for our purposes, for stable spine rather than supple or flexible spine, we want that as well. But we want to really we want to support the spine first in its natural habitat, and then perhaps kind of consider this idea of flexibility and mobilizing. So we took a little pause, we took a little sway, and then we added the option, we did a second round of that where the feet would step away. I'll do a short little bout of that. Again, same. So the feet further away, just like last week, added that added effort, a lift. Same. So a few rounds of that little bit of movement. And this containment of all of the front belly. Hamstrings should be active even more. And hoping that we can connect a little bit more to the gluteal fold. So this understanding that we do have some really good kind of clenching possibility in this portion of the glutes, but it's all the same muscle, so we're thinking about this portion here. And then this added cue to press your feet into the mat without lifting your hips. So press your feet down isometrically, and then imagine that you could pull the mat. It's hard. Pull the mat back towards your shoulders. So all of this should feel like it's turning on. So again, just creating this well-rounded concept of support for the low back. And we went from here, rolled over onto our sides, and we had the legs at 90 degrees. And again, as though your back body was against the wall. If you're doing this at home, you might challenge yourself in that way. And then we moved into these little clamshells, little but mighty clamshells. And just observing the movement for yourself, and it'll take a few rounds to maybe be okay with the subtleties. What the body's going to want to do, the thing we see most, is that the top hip's going to roll back. So we're thinking about just enough to that place that we feel resistance, where the top hip isn't, or the rotation rather in the spine isn't creating the movement. The stability of the outer hip is creating the movement. We did a few rounds of that. I'd say anywhere between 10 and 15, slow, lowering and lifting. If you can lower to just a hover rather than that complete rest. And then pausing. And then we might have added a pulse. I'm not sure if we did, but you have the option to. Just a little tiny pulse. Really, really small. So just challenging just that little range of motion in its or the firing rather, in that little capacity range of motion. And then we let that go. And then we moved the foot just a few inches forwards, and we did the same action. So it's just getting into a slightly different area of the outer hip. And that was intense. Rolled it over from there onto our backs and sent the leg to the sky. Firmed into the hips. And we might have done this last week. I'm sorry, I can't completely remember. And we did the circles. So we're really thinking about here, and although on the surface it seems like a really simple movement, the focus here is not taking the pelvis with us, but the leg bone just kind of swiveling in the cauldron of the hip socket. And that might result in really small circles and really slow movement, which is fine. And we should feel this side body kicking in here as well. So in my situation, the lifted leg is my left leg, or left side body, left side abdominals turning on. And then we took it from there into your little figure 4 with the option. So we did a forwards and back, or the option, if that felt kind of like the natural place for you to go, to there. From there, we came up, found table pose with the knees. And so this week we challenged it. Actually, we went here for a second just to find the ability to move in the shoulders. That might not have been what we did. I'm going to change my mind on that. I think I did that in my later class that last night. We did go here. So if you're putting it in the curve, it's going to feel totally easy. So I want you to challenge it and imagine this kind of on the platform type quality perhaps of the sacrum, or the junction point perhaps through the lumbar curve and the sacral area of the spine. So the block essentially weighs nothing. It's just a piece of material item to help us stay a little bit more honest. There was the option to curl the toes and hover the knees if that felt like a natural step for you. And then from there, though, we moved into our bird dog. So we extended one leg back. You want to keep the hip bone facing down, the knees facing down, and extending the arm. So there's going to be a lot of tendencies here to lax into the outer hip, to sag into the shoulder. So we want to keep this nice and strong. And this is one of those exercises that gets into a number of things. So lower abdomen, all of this quality of containment, glutes, outer hip stability, so glute med and glute min, and then those erector muscles and the multifidi muscles along the back of body. So staying kind of in communication with one another, everything working together. And then we did the same thing on the other side. From there, we came up and we found the wall. I think you can probably see me here. I'm just going to take this down maybe. So, against the wall, shoulders, head, fingers laced. And the cue is to pour the weight into one foot mindfully. So we're not kind of laxing into it that way. And so just being really, really articulate about the movement over into one side. Lift the other leg up. And then move the spine or the torso so it lands in alignment. And the lifted leg, the toes facing forward. So watch the tendency to maybe overcompensate in the pelvis. So we want to kind of create hip bones forwards, toes, kneecap forwards. And over time, so you are going to feel the standing leg outer hip for sure. But we also want to feel the top side body. And what we mentioned last week, the QL. So muscle connecting bottom rib to top of pelvis. So we had the option to stay here. I'm not sure I gave you the option to extend the arms, but if you wanted that option, you could. Slow transition back to center. So it's not about how deeply you go into the movement. We can actually come fairly far into the movement. As long as we're staying connected to that, turning on, rather than any type of laxity or softening or compensating. And then we went into these one-armed push-ups against the wall. So hand on wall, other hand on sacrum, and we were looking to just simply bend and press away. So we're watching the desire for rotation to come into the torso, and that's exaggerated, but just really watching that. So we want to stay contained through all of this area, nice and strong. Bend the elbow as you fold, and then come back up and away. So you will get some shoulder stuff happening there as well. So we did both of those on both sides. And then we came back to the mat. I do believe we did the knee fold outs at some point. I think it was in that sequencing from the back. Yeah. So we came from here, and then we went into the knee fold outs. I do apologize for that sequencing, but so I'll key you through that here. So it's just the same kind of containment, neutral spine. So if you want to think of neutral, a worm could slither underneath your spine. A worm, maybe you don't like that visual, but there's just a small little gap where it actually could slide away, and that's the lumbar curvature of your spine. When you are ready, we inhale to open and exhale to bring it back. So again, a really simple movement, and if we're not kind of thinking about all of these little details, it's pretty simple. So this leg stays stable, this leg folds out, this stays strong. And even if you focus on it, this leg wants to move, it wants to counterbalance. So we're trying to create a little bit of strength surrounding the asymmetries in the body. And over time, you might work into some range of motion that is still done from a place of integrity. And that's kind of the area we want to linger on, the places where we feel that we're at our fullest mobility, but we're not losing sight of the strength surrounding that mobility. Good. I think that was it in a nutshell. I might have missed a couple things, and that's okay. That's a good kind of little piece for you to go home with, and to work through whether you just do a couple of those things, but you make sure that you just do things with that extra depth. We're looking at this understanding that these multifidi muscles are at the bone layer, and although it doesn't seem like it, we've got layers of muscle over top of that. So we'll look at that next week, just really quickly at the beginning of class, just so we can kind of create a visual. We all learn differently, and sometimes it's good to have that visual too. So thank you all so much. If you're watching and just kind of tuning in and not necessarily attending the classes, they are Tuesdays at 6:45 at Meta Wave Yoga and Wellness in Port Elgin. So that's 60 minutes rather than just whatever time we're at here for this, but and a little bit more explanation, a little bit more time and queuing. So feel welcome to join us or send an email, metawaveyoga@gmail.com. Thanks everyone. Namaste.